So contrary to popular belief, I did not lose a bet this morning. Not with the haircut or with the suit. We are starting a brand new series today entitled Happily Ever After. And over the next 4 weeks, we invite you to journey with us as we learn God's design for marriage. And as we learn God's purposes in relationships. And I want to encourage you even now, as you sit here this morning and as you begin to take this in, this relationship, whether you're married or divorced, or you've been engaged, or you're separated, or you've never dated anybody your entire life, or you're in a dating relationship right now, this is not an opportunity for you to just check out the next 4 weeks and kind of dismiss this and write it off as though this series is only for married couples. In light of that, I want to encourage you to come and be a part of this series and actively participate, because we're going to learn tools and techniques, and we're going to discover and uncover together the mysteries and the unique design that God has intended for the marriage relationship. But these same tools can be applied in relationships that you have with your other spheres of influence at work. We're going to talk about honoring one another. And at home, with your kids or with your brother and sister, your mother and father. We're going to talk about laying down oneself for somebody else. And so there's going to be a lot of different things we're going to learn. And we're kicking things off today with this series. And we're going to look at, I'll just kind of give it away right now. We're going to look at the covenant. I'm dressed this way this morning because when you think about covenant and you think about vows, your mind likely goes toward weddings. This is how I've done, 20, 30 weddings in my 10 years as a pastor. And this is usually how I would dress to officiate a wedding. Most often people would prefer not seeing me like this, and I don't blame them. Though let's be honest, I make the suit look good. That wasn't funny. I don't know why the humor. So I got to thinking this week about vows and about covenants and commitments and times in my life where I've had to commit to something. But the process leading up to that commitment and what that was like. And I thought about a time when I was 14 years old. I was with my brother and my father and some friends, and we were at Oxbow State Park in Oregon. And we had, the river runs through there, and there's this huge rock. Oxbow Park has this huge rock that is probably, 25, 35 feet up in the air. And people would go there to cliff jump. Now, my brother was one of those daring guys who would cliff jump all the time. He would drive places to go cliff jumping. So he'd go to parts of Washington, parts of Oregon. He would travel north, south, east, and west to find cliffs that he could conquer and jump. Now, I don't know how many of you here this morning are afraid of things. I am. There's not much I'm afraid of, but one of the things I'm afraid of is snakes, and the other is heights. So I'm 14 years old. I'm with my brother, and I don't want to look. He's a lot older than me. He's in his early 20s, and I had just actually the year before I had met him. I had met my biological father and my biological brother and my sisters, and so I was just beginning to establish a relationship with him. And my brother had wrestled in college, and I was a wrestler, and so we had some similarities. But one thing I did not want to do is I did not want to be shown up by him. I didn't want to not impress him or come across as not being capable or able or cool, because let's be honest, I'm a pretty capable and able kind of guy. So we go to Oxbow Park, and we're swimming around in the river, and all of a sudden my brother says, "Hey, let's go jump off this cliff." And from where I was swimming, it seemed like a great idea. At 14 years old, you're pretty invincible, and so I swam my way up to the side of the shore and climbed up with him, went up, and realized the further that the closer that I thought we were getting to the cliff, the further we were going up. And it didn't take long for me to realize just how far off the ground we were. I got up there, and I started to look over, and people were all around because they were each jumping off, and I had no idea. I had never done this before in my life. I had no idea how deep the water was, how fast the current was, if I could clear this rock because it kind of had a bend to it. And so I'm up there, and all of a sudden, I froze with fear. What initially seemed like a great idea, what I was excited to be involved with, what I was zealous about doing, what I was so sure that was going to be a blast and determined to have a good time at, I got up there, and my good idea and my good intentions, I turned to frozen with fear. And I'm looking over there, and I was a big kid at 14. I'm a big guy now. I was genetically blessed to be this big, and that and McDonald's. And so I'm on the edge of the cliff, and I'm looking over, and my brother's there, and he's like, "All right, let's go. We'll go on 3." And I said, "Well, I need you to go first and show me how to do it." And so he said, "No problem." And without hesitation, one step, boom, off the cliff, and there he's gone. And I'm standing there, and the line starts piling up, people waiting for me. And I did what any sensible guy with a lot of courage would do. I said, you go ahead. I stood back and I let these guys jump one after the other, and then I would get close to the edge again, and I would do this thing, and I would come up with this pattern, this system in my head. Okay, on 3, I'm gonna go. And I would start rocking. Anybody rock when they jump? So I'm a rocker. And I'm like, okay, 1, 2, forget about it. And I would come back and I would make my brother, he was down in the water, Jim is his name, he'd say, come on, let's go. And at this time, my biological father, my sisters, and my family, I think it was Father's Day actually, and they're out on the shore eating lunch, which is what I should have been doing. And so he's like, come on, let's go, we gotta go, it's time to go, it's, time's ticking. And so I'm like, no, Jim, you gotta come show me one more time where you jumped from. There's a lot of space here, come on up here. So Jim gets out of the water and climbs back up the mountain. He's like, okay, so here's the deal. You're gonna wanna put your foot here where it's a little bit flat, and you're gonna wanna get a pretty good distance as you jump. Make sure you got some clearance. And then as you go in straight. You don't wanna do a backflip or belly flop, or, well, you could. I'd laugh. And so I'm there. He said, you just wanna go just straight in the water. It's plenty deep enough, and just swim to the top. You'll be all right. And he said, okay, we're gonna go on 3. Ready? And I said, all right, let's go. 1, 2, there he goes, and I'm still standing there. I hear whoosh, and then the next thing I hear is, come on! I'm like, man, he's getting angry. What's going on with you? Relax, man. Well, now the sun is starting to set, and I kid you not, I've been up there what seemed like hours. It was probably about 45 minutes, but it was after dinner, and so I'm conjuring up these ideas in my mind. You're not supposed to swim, 30 minutes after eating, so I can't do this. Technically, that would be a bad thing for me to do. And then I'll never forget, as I look around, my brother, my dad, he's getting kind of frustrated. My brother's getting ticked off. He goes, listen, either jump or walk back down, but we gotta go. And I look at the trail that we just walked up barefoot, and I look at the water, and I try to figure out how I can burn the least amount of calories. I'm a sensible guy. And so I decided that it was going to be easier just to jump, but my heart at this point is just boom, 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 boom. All I can hear is the sound of the wind accompanied by the orchestra of my heart singing, what are you doing? And so I'm looking there, and they're getting serious. Now they're starting to pack the stuff up into the truck. And so I'm sitting there. Now I'm the only one left on this ledge. My biological father and family are packing stuff up into his Mazda truck, and my brother begins to swim toward the shore. And I'm standing there all by myself, 14 years old. And then he turns around and he goes, listen, I'll make a deal with you. If you jump, I'll take you out to ice cream afterward. That's all I needed. Well, let's be honest. I said, you promise? Yeah, I promise. If you jump, just jump. I will take you to get ice cream anywhere you want to go. Dairy Queen, the biggest blizzard they have? Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. And French fries? Yeah, that's fine too. Let's go. So, I've got this promise from my brother, but I'm considering everything around me, and I'm just like, okay, if I die, at least I'll go quick, hopefully. And the reward is I get ice cream. All right, here we go. And it's one of those things where I'm like, okay, 1, 2, and on 3, as I made my way, my foot slipped. And I just lunged. I was like, and I kind of did one of these flishy, floppy, belly whoppy things. And I hit the water, bam! And I went down, and I was dead. That was it. It was the end of me. And I start drastically dog paddling to the top. And as I get to the top, I'm like, and I looked around, and I was like, that wasn't so bad. And I swim off to the side, and we got out on the shore, and my brother said, how was it? And I said, you owe me ice cream. I did it. Well, from that point on, I kind of fell in love with cliff jumping. But before I would jump with him, we would drive to these different places. Before I would jump with him, I had a system, I had a pattern where we would find these cliffs, different sizes, different shapes, different areas. But I would get in the water, which I should have done to begin with. And it made sense. I would swim as far as I could to the bottom to try to touch and kind of feel the rocks around and get familiar with my territory, know what I was getting myself into. And then I would navigate my way up the rock and get toward the top where the cliff was, and I would kind of consider everything around me. I'd get a different view of things and consider the steps I had to take, and then I would jump. And as I developed the system, I became better and more efficient at it, and it became more fun, and I became more intentional about jumping. A lot of times, I think that's how people enter into the marriage relationship. We have this great idea, and from the ground floor looking up, it looks like an awesome time. I want that. That's going to rock when I get up there. I'm going to be the center of attention. Everybody's going to watch me, and I'm going to jump in with both feet, and this is going to be amazing. Let's do it. Will you marry me? Yeah, great. Let's go. When are we doing it? I don't know. Let's do it now. Las Vegas. We're good to go. No, I told my parents I'd have a traditional wedding. I don't care. I'm not paying for it. All right, let's go. It's a good idea until you start getting all the bills and everything that goes along with that. And so you're walking up the hillside of marriage, or the wedding day. And as you get toward the top of the cliff of marriage, you're standing there, and all of a sudden your perspective changes. This usually happens inside of a year of marriage, when your wife doesn't close the cupboards. Some of you men are laughing because you know what I go through. 10 years married, and she's getting better. Ladies, you had no idea what it was like going to sit down on the toilet and falling right into the water, did you? I mean, it makes sense that guys would just put it back down when they're done, wouldn't it? And what about the toothpaste cap? Just put it back on. And wipe it off before you do, because then it gets all gunky. And then are you one of those guys who runs it across the countertop to get every last bit out, or do you roll it up, or do you just throw it away? Well, let's not forget how you cook your meals. Well, but my mom used to make it like this. Well, you didn't marry your mama, did you? You don't have to tell me twice. What is that supposed to mean? And you go back and forth. And so all of a sudden, what initially seemed like a great idea from the bottom, you get up and your perspective changes. Your view of marriage changes. And it's not just the marriage. We begin to associate it with people changing. You're not the same person I married. Well, who do you think you married? Not you. So you're saying if you had to do it over again, you wouldn't do it? I didn't say it, you did. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but since we're on the subject, and you look at it and you go, gosh, I thought marriage was supposed to be about happily ever after. This isn't what I bargained for. I mean, I thought, for some reason, I remember my vows that, do you choose to honor and respect, love and cherish, do the dishes in my laundry, that's how I remember the vows. And she remembers them totally different. Do you promise to honor and cherish, love and care for, bring me flowers and romance me, and care for my needs, including emotional? Perception is reality, people. And we all have our own perceptions of how we hear things and how we perceive them and what we do with them. And then we get into this marriage, and a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, sometime down the road, we begin to evaluate the situation. We begin to reconsider things, and you begin to think back on your childhood, that this is not at all how you thought it would play out. That Mr. Right looked very different. That she used to be so kind and wouldn't talk back to you. That you guys had it figured out financially, or how many kids you were going to have, or who was going to feed the dog. Wait, I didn't even want a dog. What do you mean who's going to feed the dog? This is a debate at our house all the time. I had a buddy who helped me get a 110-pound lab last year. My wife hates the dog and him. I'm only half joking. She kind of likes him, but hates the dog. The other night she comes in, and my friend Tom had come over, and I'm laying there watching a baseball game, and she busts the door open, and she goes, "Tom's here, and your dog peed on the floor." And walks out. And I said, well, I love you too. You want me to go talk to Tom, or you want me to clean up the pee? It just changes. Things change. And it's no longer happily ever after. It's no longer, will you love me in spite of everything? It's, do you love me? And will you commit to me in spite of everything? Our perspective changes drastically. And I think what we need to do is for those of you who have been divorced or who have broken relationships, or you're in a rocky place right now, or you're not married yet and you're considering, we come from all walks of life. Every single person here has a different story, and I guarantee you, you've been affected by divorce, whether it's either been you personally or somebody you know. And so this isn't to make anybody feel bad about their current situation or circumstances. What I want to do is I just want us to step back this morning and evaluate what a covenant is and what we're called to do in terms of the marriage relationship, as well as relationships in general. And so I want to invite you to turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 7. If you don't have a Bible, I'm going to ask you, come find me after church. I'll be the guy wearing jeans and a t-shirt in the lobby, and I'll be happy to get you one. Otherwise, you have an iPad, an iPhone, an iPod, maybe an Android, whatever. It's also going to come up here as well. We're going to look at Jesus' first sermon. Toward the end of his first sermon, he's sitting up on a mountainside where his disciples and plenty of others had followed him from Judea and Jerusalem and Galilee and the surrounding areas. And so this was a hodgepodge of people. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is teaching about a lot of things. And one of the things he teaches about is being intentional about how we live our lives. And as we read through this, I want us to understand that we need to be intentional in our relationships. We need to do our relationships on purpose. We need to covenant together and make commitments and then live them out on purpose. And so as you turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 7, I'm going to be reading from the New International Version, beginning in verse 15. And for those of you who've never been here before, I'm a lot ADD. And so what that means to you is I go on rabbit trails, but I like to stop and kind of break things down. I'm a verbal processor. So just bear with me for a minute. It says here, Jesus talking to the disciples and the followers about what's going on in their culture and around them. Jesus says, watch out for false prophets. Now, a prophet is an ambassador or a mouthpiece for God. It's somebody who receives information from God in a divine utterance, whether it be through a vision, a dream, the actual voice of God. It is a prophet who understands God, and they are used as an ambassador or a mouthpiece to relay the information from God to the people. There is clearly something going on here where Jesus has to address the idea of false prophets. There's something in the camp where people are professing to be one thing, but they're living something totally different. They're professing to be ambassadors from God, there to present information deemed authoritative by God to the people, and yet they're not living their lives in a way that would actually prove that they were ambassadors for God, or that would back up their story or what they were trying to share. He says, they come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. Jesus is talking to a culture in a context where there's a lot of sheep herders. There are farmers, and so they would have understood this example of wolves and sheep, that wolves were there to prey on these innocent sheep, and these sheep would have been a part of your herd. And so what he's saying is, there are going to be people amongst you in your flock that will come to you, and they will say that they are prophets, and they will have a hidden agenda, because they are not prophets, they are not sheep, they are actually wolves who are here to prey on you. Their motives, their intentions, their desires, and their design are not of God, and they are not for God. And then he goes on to tell them how they'll know the difference. So there's some false prophets in and amongst the people who, from the outside looking in, or from the inside looking out rather, they look like one of us. They look like their intentions are good and like they're doing good things. Verse 16, he says, by their fruit. In Galatians 5:22, it talks about the fruit of the Spirit. It's not fruits plural, it's fruit singular, and it incorporates 9 different things: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. In a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about that in terms of how we can utilize those as tools to live happily ever after and God's design for marriage for us and in our relationships. He said, you will know these false prophets by their fruit. You will be able to recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? What he's saying is these thistles and these thorn bushes, they don't produce fruit. You can plant a thorn bush and a thistle, and you can try to get it to bear fruit. My son asked me, Dad, is it true you can plant almost anything and it'll grow and it'll reproduce? I said, yeah, buddy. He said, so would that work with Skittles? I said, well, it's worth a shot. Thorn bushes and thistles were good for nothing but fuel for a fire. They were dry and they were brittle. And so what they would do is they would cut down the farmers and those in the area culturally. What they would do, the city people, is they would cut down these thorn bushes and these thistles. They would let them dry out and they would use it. They would throw it on a fire and they would use it to stoke a fire because they served no other purpose. They were of no good. And what Jesus is saying here is you can say that you're a prophet, but you don't bear fruit from a thorn bush or a thistle. And then he goes on to say in verse 17, likewise, every good tree bears fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. Verse 18, a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Jesus is saying, if you want to know where somebody really stands in their life and what they really stand for, look at the fruit of their life. They can do a lot of jaw-jacking and a lot of lip service, but look at their kids, look at their finances, look at their house, look at their lives. Look at, there's a book called Integrity by Dr. Henry Cloud. Probably top 3 of my favorite books of all time. And in the first couple of chapters, Henry Cloud talks about how each one of us leaves a wake behind us. We all have a boat. We're all likened to a boat. And we all leave a wake that people can either ski behind, or we leave a wake of destruction that hurts and damages people. But you can tell based on what kind of wake you leave, how you live your life. What kind of wake are you leaving behind people to ski behind? What kind of fruit are you bearing in your life? You see, it's one thing to say that you're a good husband or that you have a good marriage, but is there fruit in your life that demonstrates that and shows that? Are you teaching your kids valuable things in your marriage based on how you live your life? Not what you tell them. You see, we teach our kids most when we don't even realize we're teaching. So we can tell our kids, respect your wife, honor your husband, love each other. But then behind closed doors, when your kid comes up and he puts his ear to the window or the door, what's he hearing? How is he hearing you treat one another? How do you handle conflict in your marriage? How do you handle disagreements? How do you love on one another? How do you nurture one another? What about your job? Is there fruit in your job? Do people, if they had to write a letter of recommendation right now, what would that letter say? Would it produce good fruit or bad fruit? What about your relationships? If I were to walk down the hall of a high school, let's just say we're all in high school again, and you have your spheres of influence around you, you were gone, and I just interviewed them. Hey, tell me about Jack. Tell me about Lisa. What are they like? What kind of fruit would they say you're leaving? That's what Jesus is saying. We got a lot of people who talk the talk, but people aren't walking the walk. And in our marriages, people talk the talk. And we live in a society where we put on a facade and we wear masks and we go out and people need to see that what we're doing is good, that we have a good marriage, we have a good thing going. But what's going on behind closed doors? What's your marriage really like? Are you really happily ever after? Or are you a thorn bush and a thistle bearing no fruit at all and your relationship is good for nothing other than fueling a fire? And we'll talk about why in just a minute. Then he says this, not everyone who says to me, verse 21, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in the heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. What Jesus is saying here is, it's actually in a book to the early church recorded by his half-brother James. James talks about in James chapter 1 and James chapter 2, he talks about faith without deeds of being no faith at all. He talks about how if you profess one thing, and then you go and you look at yourself in the mirror and you're claiming one thing, I have a good marriage, I love my wife, I honor my children, and you live a different way, it's like turning around, walking away and completely forgetting what you look like in the mirror. Faith without deeds is no faith at all. Now don't get me wrong. What they're talking about is in terms of salvation is we don't earn our salvation. You can't will your way into heaven. You can't earn your way into heaven. You can't buy your way into heaven. You can't barter your way into heaven. You can't force your way into heaven. It is a free will offering and a gift from God through the blood of his son, Jesus Christ, on a cross over 2,000 years ago, that you and I get to come to heaven as we come before him and confess our sins. We repent and say, God, all that I am and all that I have is yours. That's how you get to heaven. There's nothing you can do to earn it. No amount of religion in this world will ever get you into heaven. I had this conversation recently with a really good friend of mine. It kind of drives me a little nutty, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but it drives me nutty when people say, well, I'm Lutheran. Yeah, I'm Methodist. Well, I grew up Baptist. What does that even mean? You're identifying with a branch of religion. But religion doesn't save anybody. Jesus says, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. No matter how many Hail Marys and how many sacraments you take and how many things you do right in the church, it's not going to save you. It's by the blood of Jesus Christ. What he's saying is, when you have a right relationship with Jesus and you have professed him as your personal Lord and Savior, your life's going to show it. You're going to look different. People are going to see change in you. Internally, the structure of your life is going to begin to shift. How you treat people, how you talk to people, what you think about people, how you interact with others is going to begin to shift. There's a soul shift that takes place. And we begin to bear different fruit. Some of us bear fruit for the first time, where people recognize that there's something different. And the idea of bearing fruit is that our lives become beneficial to others. Fruit carries with it nutrients. It carries with it taste. It carries with, there's all kinds of purposes. There's healing purposes. There's a lot of great things that fruit does for us. And what Jesus is saying is, when your life, when you profess and you live out what you profess, your life's going to bear fruit, and it will be good for others. In your marriage, when you are at the altar and you're standing there and a pastor comes to you and you meet in the middle after the bridal march, and they go through vows and they talk about for better, for worse, in sickness and in health. What that vow is that vow is a covenant where you're committing to live your life a certain way, and your life no longer is yours. Though you are independent and still have your own personality, the Bible says the two flesh become one, and you are committing, you are covenanting to something that is so much deeper and greater and broader than yourselves. And it's not a forced covenant. It is something that we willfully come into, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But sometimes people leave their covenants at the altar and choose to go and live a different lifestyle. One of adultery, one of abuse, one of brokenness, one of empty promises, one of lies. And maybe it's because that's what you were taught by your parents. Friends, I understand that more than you know. There's a thing called generational sin, and we need to pray that God will break the bondage of generational sin in our lives so that we don't leave our covenants at the altar, but that we step into these covenants mutually and we take them with us and we live out what we profess in our lives, and we live happily ever after. Man, it must be the suit. I got a lot of quiet folks today. Jesus says, therefore. And anytime it says therefore, we have to ask ourselves, what? What's it there for? What's Jesus talking about? He just gave an allegory or an example of something, and he says, therefore, and what this means is this is pattern for change. He's saying, buckle up. I educated you, now I'm going to tell you what you do with it. Therefore, Jesus says in verse 24, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down and the streams rose and the winds blew up and beat against the house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down and the streams rose and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, not as a teacher of the law or the prophets, the Pharisees, excuse me. Jesus likens a covenant of how you live your life with a builder. And what he's saying is, if you hear these words of mine and you put them into practice, you will become like an expert builder who builds their house upon the rock. And the rock is a solid foundation that when the storms of this life and when the storms of this world come against you, and trust me, if they haven't yet, they will. Relationship storms, financial storms, physical storms, work storms, the storms of this life will come. And when they do come, how does your house stand up in that type of storm? Are you building your house on a solid foundation, which is Jesus Christ? Or are you building your house on the things of this world, which is the sand? No foundation at all. What Jesus is saying is this. There's three things I think we need to understand today. Now, I'm a real simple mind. So everything for me breaks down into acronyms usually, or acrostics. So today, we're going to look at it from a vow, V-O-W. Because that's what takes place at weddings, are vows, covenants. The first one is this. We need to consider our view. We need to consider our view. When I was 14 and I was at the bottom, everything looked really good to me looking up on the cliff. It seemed like a good idea at the time. And so I jumped in with both feet and said, yep, I'm in. And I climbed the side of that mountain and got to the top of the cliff. And then when I got there, I had to readjust my thinking, and I had to consider the view as something totally different. V stands for view. Before you jump into any marriage relationship or any relationship at all, consider the view. What's it going to cost you? What's it going to cost them? What does it entail? What are your 3 R's, your responsibilities, your rewards, and your ramifications? What's this all about? Don't jump into any relationship haphazardly or half-heartedly. You see, divorce is running rampant in our culture. And the sick thing is that it's just as prevalent in the church as it is outside of the church. People, they come to the altar and they make a covenant, and their view is a lot of times it's one-track mind. They have one thing in mind, and that's what's going to take place that night. I censored it because we got a lot of little ears here tonight. I want to encourage you over the next 3 weeks, we're going to talk really candidly about some marriage topics. So you might want to invite your kids to go to the children's ministry in the future. Just a forewarning. Or we look at what we think is bliss or what we think is happiness, and our view is so skewed with the things of this world that when we step outside of it, he no longer looks the way he did, or she no longer acts the way she did, and everything changes. And so our view changes everything. Friends, before you jump into any type of relationship, specifically a marriage covenant or a commitment, and let me just talk about the covenant for a second. A covenant is a mutual agreement. It is not something that's superimposed on anybody. A covenant is a mutual agreement that is binding, not legal as in law binding, but binding as in I give my heart, I give my life, I give myself to this commitment, and vice versa. When I was on the top of the mountain looking over the cliff, and my brother said, if you jump off the cliff, I will give you ice cream. I made a covenant with him, which was my responsibility was to jump off the cliff, and his responsibility was in turn to buy me ice cream, and that was a reward. And if I hadn't done it, well, then I had to walk down the hill, and I had to try to swim across, and I would have had to hang my head low, and that would have been my ramification. God enters into a covenant with his people in Israel thousands of years ago. It's the Abrahamic covenant. What happens is he says, if you do what I lead you to do, what I ask you to do, I promise to make your generations as vast as the stars, and I will bless your people. I will take them into a land flowing with milk and honey, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. That is a covenant that God made with Abraham. And he carried it on through generations to Isaac and Jacob. God entered into a covenant mutually with man through Abraham. It wasn't something that was forced on him. Listen, we live in a culture anyway where marriages aren't forced on us. Now, I know there are some cultures that they are. They're arranged weddings, and girls usually don't have a say. But we have the freedom of choice. And when we enter into a relationship with your spouse, you are covenanting. I commit to honor you and love you and respect you. And we need to take that covenant seriously, because there are rewards when we do and there are ramifications when we don't. And we're going to talk about that for the next several weeks too. So the first thing we have to do in terms of understanding how to live happily ever after is we have to consider the view. The second thing, the O, is we have to declare our oath. We have to declare our oath. An oath is simply a covenant. It's our intentions. It's what we commit to doing. When I was up on the side of that hill, I had declared my oath to my brother. I had said, Jim, I will jump if you buy me the ice cream. And I had declared my oath for everyone to hear. That's what takes place at the altars. We are declaring our oaths to one another. We are saying, this is who I am. This is what I believe. This is what I stand for better or for worse. This is how I'm choosing to live my life. God doesn't force us into a covenant with him. He doesn't force us into an oath with him. It's a free will. We are free will creatures. We're not a bunch of robots walking around doing as God tells us to do when he tells us to do it. And you say, well, what about the 10 Commandments? That was a bunch of rules and regulations. What about the Pharisees, the 613 laws that they had to obey? Here's the deal. Those laws, those rules are for immature people who do not have a mature understanding of who God is, and they don't have a mature love for God. And so those rules are put there in place to keep people humble and whole. There's no oath there. There's no covenant there. It is God's law to protect his people until they can get to a place where they learn to love him. You see, when you love somebody, you want to honor them. You want to love them. You want to care for them. And so rules and regulations, they become second nature. Jesus says, I didn't come to abandon the law. I came to fulfill the law. And then he says, listen, it's not about the law. It's about love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind and your strength. Love God with every fiber of your being, and love your neighbor as yourself. If you do, and you commit to covenant with God, and you love God, then the rest comes together. You don't have to make yourself consumed with these 613 do's and don'ts. You don't have to worry about Exodus 20 and these 10 commandments, because by loving God, you're choosing to honor God and commit to making the most of your right relationship with God. Does that make sense? There are a bunch of legal stuff that we can look at in terms of marriage. That's why in order to abolish a marriage, you have to go through the courts and those things. But when we enter into a mutual covenant with one another, we are saying, I love you, and I'm committing to you, and I'm going to honor you, and I'm going to cherish you, and I'm going to respect you. So we need to declare our oath. What do you believe in your relationships, in dating, at work, the way you do work, in your business practices? Is it lip service? I'm going to, we have the lowest prices in town, or money back guarantee, or are you honor? I mean, you may declare that you're integrous at your work, but what are you doing with your time while you're at work? You make an oath to your employer. When you sign papers, you say, listen, I'm agreeing to work and do this job in these set of hours for this pay. You're making an oath. So for those of us who spend a large amount of time on Facebook or at the water cooler or just passing time, you're not honoring your oath, therefore you're not honoring God. And you complain about why you're not getting a promotion, why you're not getting a pay raise. Same with this is true for everything in your life. When you declare an oath, be careful. Know what you're committing to. And lastly, the W. You got to put in the work. You've got to put in the work. The W stands for work. When you consider the view, and you know what it is you're about to get into, and you declare an oath of what you stand for and what you're committing to, then you've got to be willing to put in the work. And that's usually, friends, that's usually where this falls apart. It was a good idea. I meant it at the time. It seemed like a good thing. Everybody's doing it. We were getting pressure from our parents. Let's be honest. I wanted to have sex guilt-free. Is that so bad? Everybody gets divorced. Some people get divorced 3, 4, 5 times. It's not a big deal. The reason why we even get to that place is because people aren't willing to put in the work. We live in one of the most self-entitled cultures of history. We think things are just owed to us. We're entitled to it. Guys, you're not entitled to anything. You're blessed to have anything. Period. Go live in a third world country. Your perspective about entitlement will change drastically. And I've never lived in a third world country. I can just imagine. If you want to live happily ever after, you've got to be willing to put in the work. Make the changes, make the adjustments, do what's right. Honor your spouse, love your spouse, communicate with your spouse, grow. I don't stand before you as an expert in any way. tell you this almost every single time I preach. It's getting old. I get ready to give a sermon. We get ready to start a brand new series. And whatever it is I'm going to be preaching on that week, my butt get kicked the whole week. Stacy and I had one of the roughest weeks of our marriage. Now, I'm not leaving her. She's not leaving me. It's nothing like that. What it boils down to is a breakdown of communication, because I was living entitled and she was living entitled, and we had a breakdown of communication this week. And yesterday, after I did this dare run and ride with my kid, which, by the way, you should probably go prepared when you do those things. My son asked me a couple months ago if I do this dare run and ride with him. I said, yeah, buddy, it sounds like a good idea. 1 mile, I can do that. 5-mile ride, sure, no problem. That's not a big deal. I used to ride a bike as a kid. My butt hurts so bad right now. Like everything is screaming at me. And we got there, and I totally forgot that I had covenanted. I had agreed to do this with my kid. And so we get there, and my son, who's 8, he said, all right, Dad, the run's about to start. You ready? I'm looking at my kid going, yeah, I'm going to cheer you on, buddy. You go. And my shoes were untied, and the whistle blew. They did the horn, and all of a sudden, my son and his friend Tressa are off to the races. I'm like, oh, wait for me. And so I reached down, and I tried to tie my shoes as quick as I can, and I'm lying. I took my time. But we got going. I did this mile run. I did this 5 whatever mile bike ride, and then we got home. Like he won a bike, by the way, in the middle of this thing, and he raised, a lot of you contributed. I want to thank you. He raised over $500. He was one of 7 kids in all of Scott County to raise over $500 for the DARE program. That's not to brag on Caden. That's to say we need to raise awareness for drugs and for abuse, and I think what he did was a great thing, and I'm proud of him for that, and I'm thank you for your contributions. But here's the deal. I made a commitment and a covenant to my kid that I would do this with him, and I had to be willing to put in the work. Was it fun? Mostly, because I was doing it with my son. Did my lungs appreciate it? No. Was it fun for my son? About 3 miles into the bike ride, I asked him, I said, hey, buddy, how you doing? And he goes, my legs hate you. And then all of a sudden, I felt like one of those Zumba or Pilates instructors. I'm like, feel the burn, buddy, let's go. Here I am on my buddy's mountain bike. He's got like 21 speeds, and he's got a single-speed Huffy. He's like, going uphill, and I'm like, just rolling like a little bell, ring, ring, and he's back there. It was sick, kind of. When you commit to something, you've got to be willing to put in the work. If you've ever had a broken relationship, now listen, it may not even be your fault. After 27 years of marriage, my parents divorced. 6 kids, 5 grandkids at the time. They now have 7, well, 2 on the way. And if you ask either one of my parents, they did everything they could to make the marriage work. But somewhere along the line, somebody stopped putting in the work. 27 years of marriage. So, over the next several weeks, we're going to journey together about relationships in general. Are you willing to consider your view, declare your oath, and put in the work? At work, at home, in your spheres of influence with your friends. When you make a covenant, are you willing to commit to it? Covenants are no joke. When you covenant with people, it's serious. When people come here as husband and wife and they covenant to one another, that is forever. They're making a commitment to do everything they can. They're willing to put in the work. Now, it doesn't always work that way, but they're willing to put in the work. I've been a pastor 15 years, and over the 15 years of being a pastor, I've done, I don't know, like I said, 20, 30 weddings. Countless weddings. They've been a blast. And I usually stand up there, and I love talking with the bride and the groom beforehand, because the nerves and the butterflies and the anxiety, and it's just fun for me to poke fun and mess with them. Like I send these encouraging text messages to the groom usually about a couple hours before, like, run, Forrest, run. Or I'll send these during the rehearsal of the wedding. I'll sit there and I say, I'll do the things. Okay, and do you, Michelle, promise to do whatever your husband says without arguing? And I go this whole thing. I have fun with that. I love weddings. It's one of the most beautiful covenants a couple can make ever, between a man and a wife. That a covenant could be made where they would honor one another, mutually exclusive, mutually willfully agreeing to this covenant. Nobody's forcing it, but agreeing to commit to these things. The wedding, at the end of the wedding, I love the party, the celebration. It's got food. You got music. And I mean, let's be honest, I can eat and I can dance. I can go all day. I love the receptions. Got moonwalk too. I'm gonna save that for later. I love the receptions. Before the reception is the recessional, and it's after the pastor pronounces them husband and wife, and they kiss, and they walk out, and everybody's taking pictures, and they're cheering, and it's the crowd's going nuts, and it's like fourth quarter in the Super Bowl, and everything equates back to sports, trust me. So they're going nuts, and it's crazy. They're going through, they're clapping, they're smacking hands and smacking butts and whatever else they're smacking, and they get back in the receiving line, and they're like, good job, man, woohoo, yeah. I love it when guys go up to the groom and say, hey, what are you doing tonight? Here's your sign. Before that is a lot of times they'll have a unity candle, and that really kind of is another symbolic way of showing the union that they make. And then they'll have a sand ceremony, or they'll take communion, or they'll sign the marriage certificate. And before that, the pastor will go through the ring ceremony. And before that, the vows will be exchanged between husband and wife. And the vows are the covenant that they're going to make to one another to live happily ever after. Before that, it's the I do's, or the declaration of consent. And before that, it's the charge to the couple, where the pastor kind of gives them some encouragement and some instruction. But before that, I'll tell you, one of the craziest weddings I've ever done was at a funeral home. I was young and stupid, and it was a medieval wedding. Dudes showed up in this garb that, I'll be honest, scared the crap out of me. And she was pretty eccentric too, like they were wearing purples and reds, and it was nutty. But the songs that they picked beforehand were phenomenal. I love music. I love wedding songs. I love the walkout songs, like when they walk out with Mission Impossible theme, and they're coming out, and or they walk out. For us, I think we were supposed to walk out to How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You, something like that. And my aunt got the wires crossed, and we walked out to elevator music. Na 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 na. But the song before that, the bridal march, is the anticipation that's been building in people. The bridal march is it's key. It's the kickoff. It's when the whistle blows and the game's on. And everybody stands, and the bride comes down, and everybody just clamors at the bride, and they're like, oh my gosh, isn't she lovely? That kind of, at least everything's a song in my world. And so that goes on, and the song's coming down, and here comes a bride, and everybody's taking pictures, and all the women are crying, all the men are going, what was I thinking? Run, dude, run, and this whole thing, all this stuff goes on. But the song tells a lot about a couple. And so I love doing weddings where I would stand here, and the music would sound something similar to this.